Now we have this basic idea for how evolution works through variation and selection. Let's go into some specifics, including common misconceptions about evolution. Evolution is simply a change in a population over time. How much change is required? It can actually be any amount of genetic change from one generation to the next. It doesn't even have to be an obvious external trait. There could be a change in a gene or even a non-gene region. If there's a change in the DNA and it gets selected for, it is change over time. It will change the genetic makeup of that species, that population. Let's take a look at this amazing video showing bacteria as they evolve resistance to an antibiotic.
So what we ended up building was basically a petri dish, except that it's 2 feet by 4 feet. And the way we set it up is that there are 9 bands, and at the base of each of these bands, we put a normal petri dish thick agar with different amounts of antibiotic. On the outside, there's no antibiotic. Just in from that, there's barely more than the E. coli can survive. Inside of that, there's 10 times as much, 100 times, and then finally the middle band has 1,000 times as much antibiotic. And then across the top of it, pour some thin agar that bacteria can move around in. The background is black because there's ink in it, and the bacteria appear as white. First, you see they spread in the area where there's no antibiotic, up until the point they can no longer survive. Then a mutant appears on the right. It's resistant to the antibiotic, it spreads, until it starts to compete with other mutants around it. When these mutants hit the next boundary, they too have to pause and develop new mutations to make it into 10 times as much antibiotic. And then you see the different mutants repeat this at 100. And after about 11 days, they finally make it into 1,000 times as much antibiotic as the wild type can survive. And so we can see by this process of accumulating successive mutations that bacteria, which are normally sensitive to an antibiotic, can evolve resistance to extremely high concentrations in a short period of time.
Many people ask questions about species that they've heard have not evolved. Sharks are one example. Turtles are another example. Horseshoe crabs, the coelacanth, a fish, a tree known as a ginkgo, anything with traits that seem ancient. But it's not true that they haven't changed. Sharks today are not the same species that existed 200 million years ago. Thank heavens we no longer have these sharks around, which were massive and terrifying. Sharks have also changed tremendously in internal structures as well as some external traits like fin shape. How about turtles? Ancient turtles actually started with one shell, and amazingly it was the bottom one. Turtles from the past look similar to today's turtles, but many were massive. We don't see that today. Many turtles had spikes on their tail, or they had teeth. Turtles today, not a single one has teeth. This land turtle could not retract its head, unlike land turtles today. So turtles have changed tremendously, but many people aren't aware of these traits, so it seems as though they have not changed in hundreds of millions of years. What kind of change counts as evolution? What if the change happens, but then it changes back again? Does that mean that no change has occurred? Actually, it means that twice as much change has occurred. This example of the peppered moth is often used in biology textbooks. When I was a student and heard about this example, I thought it was terrible because it was just some color that changed back and forth. Now I realize what a great example it is. In the Industrial Revolution around London, There was tons of coal burned. It was dirty and disgusting and covered the whole of London in dark soot. The peppered moth had natural variation from a light color with a few black speckles, a peppered appearance, to so many speckles that the moth was dark in color. Before the Industrial Revolution, variation existed, but the peppered variety was better camouflaged on the lichens that grew on tree trunks. Lichens are very sensitive to air pollution, though. So as the amount of coal soot increased, the lichens died, and the darker colored moths survived better on the soot-covered tree trunks. So the darker peppered moths became much more prominent. They were selected for. When London cleaned its air by placing restrictions on coal burning, the dark soot was replaced again by light-colored lichens. The population of peppered moths shifted back to the peppered coloration pattern. Evolution is just change over time. Any change that happens, even if it goes back and forth, is still an example of evolution. How much time is needed for evolution? Just 1 generation. An individual itself cannot evolve because it has the genes that it's born with. There's no change in those genes. But as genes get passed from one generation to the next, mutations and recombinations increase the variety of genes available. As more generations continue on, genetic change can build up. More time equals greater change. But that doesn't mean that there's no change in a smaller amount of time. It's just a smaller amount of change. That brings us to micro and macro evolution. Microevolution is small change over small time. These are things we can see over decades, centuries, or millennia. These are short periods of time in evolutionary terms. Examples include antibiotic resistance, dog breeds, and recent shifts in populations due to climate change. Because these are small changes, they generally occur in populations within a species. The peppered moth example was microevolution. There isn't enough change to result in a new species. Another example are these sparrows, which were introduced east of the Rockies about 200 years ago. Their populations grew and they spread out into northern and southern regions. Over time, the sparrows in the southern region grew smaller, which allows them to dissipate heat well, and their lighter color blends in better with that environment. Northern birds were selected to be heavier, which allows them to retain heat better. They were darker, allowing them to blend into the darker forested habitat. These sparrows are not separate species yet, but their differences are increasing over time. Macroevolution refers to the evolution of anything above the species level, a species, genus, family, etc. These changes build up until they become reproductively isolated. Macroevolution happens at a macro amount of time. Dog breeds, for example, are about 10,000 years or thousands of years, but large amounts of time in terms of evolution are tens of millions or even billions of years. One extreme example of macroevolution is the evolution of whales, which evolved from an early deer-wolf-like ancestor about 55 million years ago. Some people accept microevolution, but do not accept macroevolution. The only thing that differs between these two categories of evolution is the amount of time. But the difficulty makes sense because we generally struggle to understand the concept of millions of years. If we have two traits that build up differences in each generation, how many traits could be different after 10 generations? Changes can build up exponentially. In the first generation, the population could have 0 changes, 1 change, or 2 changes. In the next generation, those that had no changes could then have an additional no change, 1 change, or 2 changes. Those that had 1 change in the first generation could have 0, 1, or 2 changes in the next generation, and so on. So instead of 2 plus 2 plus 2, etc., it's actually multiples. So 2 times 2 times 2. So rather than 20 changes, there are actually 1,000 potential changes. Evolutionary change is exponential, not linear. This is important in understanding that difference between micro and macro evolution. Microevolutionary changes are similar to the linear rate of change, but macroevolution can change much more than linear changes in the same amount of time. So not only do we struggle with thinking about large amounts of time, we also have difficulty thinking in exponential terms. This slide provides some really general examples of an evolutionary change timeline. As we increase the taxonomic levels from more specific to more general, changes occur over longer and longer times. Smaller changes in smaller amounts of time are down here. Larger changes in larger amounts of time are up here. Bigger amounts of time build up bigger differences. Evolution is a process, no matter how much time has occurred. Mutations and genetic recombination occur mostly randomly. The selection process can only occur among the genes that are present in the population. So while the best possible traits are selected for in that environment, they are never perfect traits because they are not intentionally produced. Also, since the environment constantly changes, the traits are always a little bit behind. This results in the big concept that there is no perfectly adapted species for its environment.